The rain came down not as water, but as judgment. It hammered the corrugated tin roof of the stable until the sound was a physical blow, a frantic drumming that matched the frantic pulse in Clara's own throat. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of wet hay, horse sweat, and the whiskey-sour breath of Foreman Hayes. Lantern light threw long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar stalls into cages and the men into looming grotesques. At the center of the tense tableau was the stallion, a magnificent creature of shadow and muscle, a living relic descended from the war horses of Spanish conquistadors. His coat, the color of polished mahogany, was matted with rain and blood. A vicious gash, torn open by a rusted strand of barbed wire during the storm's initial fury, laid bare the muscle on his flank. He trembled, not from cold, but from pain and the raw, aggressive energy of the men surrounding him. Clara knelt beside him, her hands gentle but firm, applying a poultice of comfrey and yarrow. The stallion, who would not suffer a man to approach him without a fight, stood stone still under her touch. He trusted her. It was a trust that had taken months to build, a quiet language spoken in soft murmurs, slow movements, and the shared understanding of solitude. "Get away from that animal." Hayes's voice was a low growl, frayed with impatience and cheap liquor. He stood with his boots planted wide, a bull of a man whose authority was derived not from respect, but from the fear he cultivated as deliberately as a gardener tends his weeds. His face, ruddy and coarse, was twisted in a sneer of rage. "It's ruined! Damaged goods! Morrison will want him put down, not coddled with your swamp witch remedies." Clara didn't look up. Her focus was entirely on the stallion, on the subtle shift of his weight, the flicker of his ear. She could feel his pain as if it were her own, a hot, searing line. "He's not ruined. He's hurt. This will keep the infection out until the vet can get through in the morning." Her voice was quiet, a stark contrast to the storm and the foreman's bluster, yet it held a core of unyielding steel. "I give the orders here." Hayes stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her and the horse. The other ranch hands, 4 of them, huddled near the door like nervous sheep, shuffled their feet and avoided her gaze. They were good men mostly, but they were men who needed a paycheck, who knew the brutal math of ranch life. A foreman's word against a lone hand's, the sum was always the same. "And I'm saying that horse is a liability. We've wasted enough time and money on his temper. This is the last straw." He sees a liability, Clara thought, her fingers stroking the stallion's powerful neck. He sees a line item in a ledger. "I see a life. I see a spirit so fierce it refuses to be broken by a world of fences and brands." "You're wrong," she said, finally raising her eyes to meet his. They were clear and direct, holding no fear, only a profound and sorrowful certainty. It was this lack of fear that infuriated Hayes the most. He couldn't dominate it. His face darkened. "Am I?" He took another step, his presence a physical threat. The stallion sensed the shift, his body tensing, a low rumble starting in his chest. "You think your little horse whisperer act makes you special? You're just a hired hand, and a mouthy one at that." He gestured dismissively at the other men. "They know the score. You don't buck the foreman. You don't buck the brand." A flicker of movement from the stable door. Mr. Morrison himself, the owner, stood silhouetted against the churning, rain-lashed darkness. He was a tall, imposing man, his face carved from the same pragmatic, unyielding stone as the mountains that bordered his vast ranch. Power clung to him like the scent of expensive leather. He surveyed the scene, his eyes missing nothing. The defiant woman, the furious foreman, the injured horse, the silent, complicit men. "What's the problem, Hayes?" Morrison's voice was calm, but it cut through the noise of the storm like a razor. Hayes straightened up, his demeanor shifting from bully to aggrieved subordinate. "Clara, sir," refusing a direct order. The stallion tore himself up on the south fence. "I was telling her it's a lost cause, but she insists on playing vet." Morrison's gaze fell on Clara, and it was as cold and impersonal as a banker's appraisal. He had built this empire from nothing, buying up land, absorbing smaller ranches, running it all with an iron will and a belief in a simple, brutal hierarchy. You own the land, you own the animals, you own the labor of those who worked for you. Compassion was a luxury, an inefficiency he had long since stripped from his operations. "Is that true, Clara?" he asked. Clara rose slowly to her feet, her small frame dwarfed by the men and the horse, yet she seemed to be the anchor of the entire scene. "He can be saved, Mr. Morrison. He just needs care. It's a clean wound, deep but clean. Putting him down would be a waste." She chose her word carefully, appealing to the only language she thought he might understand. Morrison looked from her to the horse, then back to Hayes. He saw a choice: the word of his foreman, the man he paid to enforce his will, or the plea of a ranch hand who felt too much. For a man like Morrison, it wasn't a choice at all. It was a reaffirmation of the established order. "A ranch hand doesn't question the foreman," Morrison said, the words falling like stones. "Hayes is in charge of the stock. His decision stands." He didn't look at the stallion, didn't allow himself to see the magnificent life trembling in the lantern light. He saw only a disruption, a challenge to his chain of command. Hayes's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. "You hear that? Now get out of the way." But Clara didn't move. She placed her body between Hayes and the stallion. A wave of righteous anger, hot and pure, burned away the last of her caution. "No, if you want to kill him, you'll have to go through me." The silence that followed was absolute. The storm, the rain, the shuffling men, it all faded away, leaving only this one impossible moment of defiance. The other hands stared, their mouths agape. This wasn't just insubordination. It was a kind of madness. Morrison's face, which had been a mask of cool pragmatism, hardened into something else. This was a direct challenge not just to his foreman, but to him, to his ownership, to the very principles on which his world was built. "Fine," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "If you feel that strongly, you can take your compassion elsewhere. Hayes." "Sir?" "Fire her. Get her things from the bunkhouse and get her off my land. Now." The words were a death sentence. To be cast out, without pay, into a storm of this magnitude miles from the nearest town was not just dismissal, it was abandonment. It was an act of profound cruelty. Hayes's grin was positively feral. "With pleasure, sir." He turned to Clara, his eyes gleaming. "You heard the man. You're done here. Get out." Clara stood frozen for a second, the full weight of the pronouncement crashing down on her. Her entire world, the small bunk, the meager pay, the vast sky, the horses that were her only family, was collapsing. She looked at the stallion, and in his dark, intelligent eye, she saw a reflection of her own desperate injustice. She had fought for him, and in doing so, had lost everything. One of the younger hands, a boy named Pete, made a half-step forward, a protest forming on his lips, but a sharp glance from Hayes sent him shrinking back into the shadows. The collective judgment of the herd had been rendered. Clara was the outcast. Hayes grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like claws. "I said, get out!" She shook him off, her pride a final tattered shield. "I can walk on my own." She cast one last lingering look at the stallion. His head was high, his ears pricked forward, watching her. There was an understanding in that gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the sacrifice. It was the only farewell she received. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the stable's small circle of light and into the violent, roaring darkness. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, the sound swallowed by a deafening peal of thunder. The wind tore at her, whipping her hair across her face and driving the icy rain into her skin like 1,000 tiny needles. Her world had not just collapsed, it had been utterly and completely erased, leaving her alone in the heart of the storm, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a righteous anger that was already beginning to curdle into the cold, sharp tang of despair. The wilderness was not a place. It was a presence. It swallowed her whole the moment the stable door shut. The thin bubble of human order, of light, warmth, and fragile rules, had popped, leaving her in an elemental world that was hostile to her very existence. The wind was a physical force, a bully that shoved and tore at her thin shirt, seeking the warmth of her skin with greedy, icy fingers. Rain, driven sideways, found its way down her collar and up her sleeves, plastering her clothes to her body until she felt she was wearing a second skin made of cold mud. Each step was a battle against the sucking grasp of the trail, which had dissolved into a treacherous slurry. Lightning bleached the world white for a heart-stopping second, revealing a landscape of writhing trees and churning gray sky, then plunged her back into a disorienting absolute blackness. Thunder followed, a visceral concussion that vibrated through the ground and into the soles of her feet, a reminder of her own insignificant scale. Her anger, the hot righteous flame that had sustained her in the stable, began to flicker and die, starved of oxygen in the face of such overwhelming power. What replaced it was a despair so vast and empty it felt like the sky itself. She had been cast out. The words echoed in her mind, a rhythm that matched the relentless drumming of the rain. Get off my land, get out. Her life had been pared down to this one brutal act of walking. Where was she even going? The nearest town, Blackwater, was a 10-mile walk in good weather. In this, it was a death march. Her thoughts, unmoored, drifted back to the stallion. A pang of guilt, sharp and sickening, twisted in her gut. She had failed him. Her grand gesture of defiance had accomplished nothing but her own exile. Hayes would be standing over him now, maybe with a rifle. The image was so clear, so horrifying, that she stumbled, catching herself on the slick bark of a pine tree. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the picture remained, burned onto the inside of her eyelids. The noble head, the trusting eyes, the final, deafening crack of the gun. A sob, torn from the deepest part of her, was ripped from her lips and instantly stolen by the wind. She was crying, but the rain washed the tears from her face before they could even trace a path. She was utterly, completely alone. It was then that she heard it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the wind, a strange harmonic created by the air rushing through the canyon pass. But it came again, a sound that cut through the storm's chaotic symphony. It was not the neigh of a horse, not the panicked whinny of a lost animal. It was deeper, more resonant. A call. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. A long, low note that vibrated in her bones. A question asked in a language older than words. She stopped, straining to hear over the howl of the wind and the roar of a nearby creek, now swollen to a raging torrent. Had she imagined it? Was her mind, frayed by despair and cold, starting to conjure ghosts? She took another step, then another, pushing the sound from her mind. It was nothing. It was the wind. But it came again, closer this time, and it was answered. From another direction, a second call, a different pitch, but the same resonant timbre. Then a third, from somewhere behind her. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs with a new kind of fear, a fear that had nothing to do with the storm. This was the fear of the unknown, of the impossible. A flash of lightning illuminated the ridge to her left, and for a split second she saw it. A silhouette, a horse, standing motionless, its head raised to the tempestuous sky. It was too far to make out details, but it was unmistakably a horse. It should have been seeking shelter, not standing exposed on a high ridge in a violent electrical storm. Before the thunder could reply, another flash, this one closer. On the trail ahead, not 50 yards away, stood another horse. Its head was turned towards her, its form a perfect dark cutout against the momentary searing white. Then darkness again. Clara's breath hitched. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A couple of horses got loose from a neighboring ranch in the storm. It was possible. Unlikely they'd be so calm, but possible. She started walking again, her pace quickened now by a creeping dread. The calls continued, a network of sound weaving itself through the fabric of the storm. They were all around her. She crested a small rise that overlooked a meadow, and another bolt of lightning tore the sky in two. The sight that met her eyes stole the air from her lungs. The meadow was filled with them. Dozens of silhouettes, standing silent and still in the downpour. They weren't huddled together for warmth or safety. They were arranged in a loose, deliberate circle, and she was walking directly into its center. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. This was wrong. This was unnatural. A stampede was chaos and noise. This was silence and order. She spun around, thinking of retreat, but behind her, blocking the path she had just taken, stood 3 more horses, their bodies like statues carved from the night. She was surrounded, yet there was no menace, no flattened ears, no bared teeth, no stomping hooves. There was only a profound collective stillness, a watchfulness. She began to recognize them now, in the strobing, intermittent light, the distinctive white blaze of Henderson's prize-winning mare, the massive, pale form of Miller's Belgian draft horse, an animal that never left its own pasture. She saw pintos, Appaloosas, bays, and roans, horses from every ranch in the valley, ranches separated by miles of fences and canyons. And they were all here, together, impossible. Her terror began to morph into something else, something she had no name for. It was a feeling of awe, so immense it bordered on fear. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was a hallucination, a fever dream brought on by hypothermia and shock. But the intuitive part of her, the part that understood the silent language of horses, knew that this was real. Horrifyingly, miraculously real. She stood shivering in the center of the impossible gathering, the rain plastering her hair to her skull, the wind a constant shriek. She was no longer just a woman lost in a storm. She had become the center of a mysterious, supernatural event. The horses watched her, their collective gaze a palpable force. It felt like they were waiting for something. It felt like they were waiting for her. The calls on the wind had not been random. They had been a summons, and somehow she had been the one called. The feeling of being an outcast, of being alone, vanished, replaced by a much more terrifying and wondrous sensation. She was the reason for this. She was the focal point of a power she could not begin to comprehend. Alone in the wilderness, soaked and trembling, Clara became the unwilling priestess of a church made of storms and horseflesh, the center of a silent, watchful congregation that had answered a call beyond human hearing. The night bled into a bruised, gray dawn. The storm, having exhausted its fury, softened to a persistent, weeping drizzle. The sky was the color of a fresh contusion, a palette of purples and yellows on the eastern horizon. As the light grew, it revealed the true, staggering scale of the phenomenon. What had been dozens of silhouettes in the lightning flashes was now a sea of horseflesh, a living, breathing herd that stretched across the meadow and up the forested slopes. There were hundreds of them. A river of life, silent and purposeful, had converged on this single point in the wilderness, and Clara was at its heart. The fear of the night had receded, leaving behind a state of profound, surreal calm. She was no longer cold. A strange internal warmth had spread through her, a product not of body heat, but of the sheer, overwhelming presence of the animals around her. They had kept a respectful distance throughout the night, forming a living windbreak, their collective body heat creating a small pocket of tempered air where she stood. Now, as the day broke, a silent, unspoken consensus seemed to pass through them. The great procession began. It was not a stampede, it was a pilgrimage. The massive Belgian draft, Miller's pride, moved first, his great hooves sucking at the mud with a sound like a slow, deep drum beat. Henderson's mare fell in beside him. Slowly, majestically, the entire herd began to move, flowing back down the trail toward the Morrison Ranch. They didn't drive Clara. They flowed around her, creating a space for her at the very head of the column. She walked, dazed, not as a leader, but as an honored passenger on this impossible current. The sound was hypnotic. The soft thud of thousands of hooves on the wet earth, the gentle snorting, the rustle of their bodies brushing against the wet foliage. It was a soundscape of immense, peaceful power. As they drew closer to the ranch, she could see the evidence of chaos. But it wasn't the chaos she had feared. There was no smoke, no sign of the fire she had half expected Hayes might set to cover his tracks. Instead, there was the aftermath of a mass exodus. Fences were not so much broken as simply dismantled. Heavy wooden rails were snapped cleanly in two, gates were torn from their hinges. The dust of their departure still hung in the damp air around the main barn and paddocks. The ranch, which had been a symbol of Morrison's rigid control, was now a portrait of its complete and utter failure. The animals had not been stolen or scattered. They had simply left. They had answered the call. The ranch hands were the first to see them. They stood in a stunned, disbelieving cluster near the ruined main gate, their faces pale with exhaustion and confusion. Pete, the young hand, saw her first. His jaw dropped, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and reverence. He pointed, and the others turned. Their frantic energy, their attempts to patch fences and account for the missing stock, ceased. They could only stare as the living river of horses, with Clara at its center, approached the ranch. Then, Mr. Morrison emerged from the ranch house, his face a thundercloud of rage and sleeplessness. He was holding a coiled lariat, a symbol of the control he was so desperately trying to reassert. When he saw the approaching herd, his expression shifted from anger to pure, unadulterated fury. And when he saw Clara, walking calmly at the head of it all, his mind, incapable of processing the miraculous, jumped to the only conclusion it could grasp: malice. "Clara!" he roared, his voice cracking with strain. He strode forward, oblivious to the majesty of the scene, seeing only his own authority being mocked. "What is this? What devilry is this? You did this!" He stopped 20 feet from her, his body rigid with accusation. The horses came to a slow, collective halt behind her, their stillness a stark contrast to his agitation. "You think this is some kind of joke?" he spat, his eyes wild. "To turn my own men against me? To steal every horse in the valley to make a point? Henderson and Miller have been on the radio all night. They think I'm a horse thief. You will hang for this, I swear to God." Clara looked at him, and for the first time she felt not fear or anger, but a profound sense of pity. He stood there, this powerful man, this king in his own kingdom, and he was utterly blind. He saw only trickery, conspiracy, and financial loss. He could not see the wonder. He could not see the truth that was standing, breathing, right in front of him. "I didn't do this, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice steady and clear. It carried easily in the quiet, damp air. "I don't know how this happened. They just came." "Lies!" he shouted, taking another step forward. "Horses don't just come. They are taken. They are branded. They are owned. You have somehow done this to ruin me." His worldview, built on the bedrock of ownership and control, was cracking. The evidence before him was impossible, so his mind rejected it, replacing it with a narrative of human treachery, because that, at least, was understandable. This standoff was not merely between a ranch owner and a former hand. It was a confrontation between two entirely different realities. One was the world of human law, of fences and property lines, a world where nature was a resource to be managed and exploited. The other was the world she had just walked out of, a world of deeper, more ancient laws, of a forgotten language and a power that paid no mind to the deeds and titles of men. The lead horses, the Belgian and the mare, shifted their weight, their intelligent eyes fixed on Morrison. Their gaze was not hostile, but it was heavy, with a silent, unnerving judgment. They stood as witnesses, their presence a quiet refutation of every word he spoke. Clara didn't need to defend herself. The evidence was all around him, a silent, irrefutable jury of hundreds. Morrison, trembling with a rage born of incomprehension, stood on the precipice of his own understanding, staring into an abyss of natural wonder that he had mistaken for a simple act of human revenge. The tension was a living thing, a shimmering wall between the man who believed he owned the world and the woman who had just discovered it was a far wilder, more mysterious place than he could ever imagine. The standoff stretched, thin and brittle. The sound of an approaching truck engine broke the spell, grinding its gears as it navigated the muddy, rutted road. It was Sheriff Dunar's vehicle, a dusty Ford with the county seal on the door. Following close behind was another truck, rattling with the frantic energy of its occupants, the other ranchers, Henderson and Miller. They spilled out before the vehicles had even come to a complete stop, their faces etched with sleepless fury and anxiety. "There they are!" Henderson shouted, pointing a trembling finger. He was a small, wiry man whose wealth was tied up in his prize-winning bloodlines. "Dunar, you see? All of them. And her. She's at the head of it." Miller, a heavy-set man whose face was perpetually flushed, nodded vigorously. "That's my Belgian. What in the hell is going on, Morrison? We thought you had a stampede, but this looks like you've rounded up every head of stock in the county." Sheriff Dunar, a man accustomed to disputes over fences and water rights, stepped forward slowly, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his holstered pistol. He was a man of human law, of clear lines and verifiable facts, and what he was looking at made no sense. He saw Clara, a woman he knew only as a quiet ranch hand, standing placidly before a supernatural assembly. He saw Morrison, a man he knew as the unshakable pillar of the community, looking cornered and half mad. All right, let's all just calm down," Dunar said, his voice carrying the practiced weight of authority, though his eyes betrayed his deep bewilderment. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Clara directly, "can you tell me what in God's name is happening here?" Before Clara could answer, a new voice cut through the air, dripping with venom and desperation. "She's a witch! That's what's happening!" Foreman Hayes stumbled out from behind the bunkhouse. He was disheveled, his face pale and clammy, his eyes shot with red. He had clearly spent the night drinking, trying to drown the seeds of doubt and failure that had been planted in him. The sight of Clara, not broken and lost, but at the head of this impossible procession, had shattered his fragile sense of superiority. "She's the one!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "She cursed the stallion and now she's done this. She's got some dark power in her." The accusation, absurd as it was, hung in the charged air. In a world suddenly devoid of rational explanation, the irrational began to seem plausible. Henderson and Miller looked from Hayes to Clara, their anger now tinged with a superstitious fear. It was at that precise moment that the main stable door, the one Clara had been cast out of, creaked open. A collective gasp went through the assembled men. Framed in the dark doorway was the stallion. He stepped out into the gray morning light, his mahogany coat gleaming as if freshly groomed, his muscles rippling with contained power. He held his head high, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The men stared, mouths agape at his flank. The gash, the deep, gruesome wound that had been the catalyst for this entire ordeal, was gone. Not healing, not scarred over. It had vanished. The skin was smooth, perfect, covered in a seamless sheen of healthy hair. It was not a healing. It was a restoration, a miracle. The stallion ignored the stunned men. His eyes found Clara. With a grace that belied his size, he walked directly to her, the crowd of humans parting before him as if by an invisible force. He stopped at her side, lowered his magnificent head, and nudged her hand with his nose, a gesture of profound trust and affection. Then, he raised his head again and positioned himself slightly in front of her, a living shield between her and the hostile world of men. He stood his ground, a king who had chosen his queen, his presence a silent, irrefutable testimony. The miracle of his healing stunned the men into silence, but what happened next shattered their understanding of the world. The stallion let out a sound. It was not a neigh or a whinny. It started as a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to originate from the very earth beneath their feet. It was a note of deep antiquity, filled with a sorrow and a power that was utterly non-human. And then, a sound rose up to meet it. From the hundreds of assembled horses, a chorus swelled. Henderson's mare picked up the harmony, the big Belgian added a bass note, and soon the entire valley was filled with the song of the herd. It was a sound that defied description. It was a complex, layered symphony of tones and vibrations, a form of communication so profound it bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. It was a living story told in sound. It spoke of iron and blood, of Spanish wars on distant continents, of a lineage of proud spirits. It spoke of the sting of barbed wire, the cold finality of a branding iron, the loneliness of the stall. It spoke of the storm, the call on the wind, the gathering in the night. And through it all, it sang of a single act of compassion, a gentle hand, a soothing voice, a woman who had stood for one of them when no one else would. The song was a judgment, a ballad, and a declaration of allegiance. The humans were overwhelmed. They staggered back, hands covering their ears, not because the sound was loud, but because it was too much to contain. It was a truth so raw and elemental that their minds, accustomed to the simple syntax of words, could not process it. Sheriff Dunar looked pale, his hand fallen away from his gun. Morrison had sunk to his knees in the mud, his face a mask of awe and terror, the foundations of his world washed away by this sonic tide. Henderson and Miller were weeping openly, not knowing why. Only one man reacted with violence. Hayes, his reality completely fractured, his cruelty and insecurity laid bare, saw not a miracle but the ultimate symbol of his own humiliation. The stallion, healed and magnificent, standing in fealty to the woman he had cast out, was an unbearable sight. With a guttural scream of pure rage, he pulled a pistol from the waistband of his jeans. "Damn you!" he shrieked, his face a contorted mask of hate. "Damn you all to hell!" He raised the gun, his shaking hand aiming directly at the stallion's proud head. Clara reacted without thinking, stepping in front of the stallion, her arms spread wide. But she was too slow. The stallion, however, was not. He saw the threat. He saw the gun. And he did not bolt. He did not rear. He stood his ground, a solid wall of muscle and loyalty, to protect the woman who had protected him. His dark eye, fixed on Hayes, held no fear, only a calm, unwavering certainty. In that single, breathtaking moment, he proved his intelligence, his courage, and his loyalty beyond any shadow of a doubt. It was the final, undeniable word in an argument that had transcended language. "Hayes, no!" Morrison's voice, raw and broken, tore from his throat. He scrambled to his feet just as Sheriff Dunar, jolted from his stupor, lunged forward. But it was the song of the horses that sealed the foreman's fate. As Hayes's finger tightened on the trigger, the collective sound of the herd rose in a deafening crescendo, a wave of pure sonic force that struck him like a physical blow. He cried out, dropping the gun as if it had turned white-hot in his hand. He stumbled backward, tripped, and fell sprawling into the mud, a broken and defeated man, silenced at last by a language he could never hope to comprehend. The confrontation was over. Vindication had arrived, not in the voice of a man but on the breath of 1,000 horses. The silence that followed the crescendo was more profound than any sound. The horses' song faded, leaving an echo in the soul, a resonance that had permanently altered the landscape of every human heart that had heard it. Hayes lay sobbing in the mud, a pathetic ruin of a man. Sheriff Dunar calmly retrieved the fallen pistol, his face grim and thoughtful. He looked at Clara, then at the stallion standing guard over her, and simply shook his head, a gesture of surrender to a power far beyond his jurisdiction. Morrison walked forward, his steps heavy, his arrogant stride gone, replaced by the hesitant gait of a humbled man. He stopped before Clara, his eyes not on her, but on the stallion's miraculously healed flank. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch, but as if to feel the warmth of the impossible. He began, his voice thick with emotion. He swallowed hard, his gaze finally rising to meet Clara's. The cold, pragmatic light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, sorrowful understanding. I was wrong, he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of certainty being dismantled. I saw only assets. I didn't see. He looked around at the silent, watchful herd. I didn't listen. He turned to the disgraced foreman. Hayes, he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old command, but tempered now with a weary gravity. Get your things. Get off my land. The words were the same ones he had used on Clara, but the meaning was entirely different. It was not an act of cruel banishment, but a sentence of just exile. A quiet, final dismissal of the old way of thinking. Hayes, with the help of a stone-faced Sheriff Dunar, was escorted away, his departure marking the end of an era of dominance and fear. Then Morrison turned back to Clara. I owe you more than an apology, he said. What you did, what happened here, I don't understand it, but I know it was born from you, from your compassion. He gestured vaguely at the foreman's empty cottage, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods a short distance from the main house. Hayes's position is open. The house comes with it. He paused, then corrected himself, as if realizing the inadequacy of the offer. No, that's not right. This isn't a job I'm offering, it's a partnership. This ranch, it needs to learn how to listen. Maybe you can teach us. He looked her in the eye, and for the first time, she saw not an owner, but a guardian asking for help. Please, he added, the words stripped of all pride. A quiet had fallen over the other ranchers as well. Henderson and Miller approached, not with anger, but with a quiet awe. They walked toward their horses, not with ropes and halters, but with open hands and soft voices. A silent negotiation began to take place all across the field. Some of the horses, after a nuzzle and a moment of quiet communion with their owners, began to drift away, heading for their own distant homes. There was no resistance, no attempt to corral them. The choice was theirs. But many stayed. Dozens, then scores of horses, including Henderson's prize mare and Miller's Belgian, chose to remain. They formed a new herd, a herd bound not by fences, but by a shared experience, a collective memory of the night they answered the call. They had chosen their home. The resolution settled over the valley as gently as the evening fog that would soon roll in from the mountains. It was a peace that felt earned, forged in the crucible of the storm and the fire of confrontation. It was a new covenant, written not on paper, but on the land itself. As twilight painted the sky in soft hues of rose and lavender, Clara stood on the porch of her new home. The air was cool and clean, smelling of damp earth and pine. The cottage was simple, but it was hers. It was a home, a place of belonging she had never known. A short distance away, in the pasture that was now his by right, the stallion grazed peacefully. He would occasionally lift his head, his dark eyes finding hers, a silent check-in, a reaffirmation of their unbreakable bond. The horses that had chosen to stay were scattered across the rolling hills, a living tapestry of trust and freedom. Morrison had been true to his word. Fences were being redesigned, feeding practices changed, and the entire rhythm of the ranch was being reevaluated, not for efficiency, but for harmony. It was a slow, difficult process, like learning a new language, but it had begun. Clara watched the last light fade from the sky, a profound sense of peace settling deep into her bones. It was not the easy peace of an untroubled life, but the resilient, hard-won peace that comes after the storm. It was the peace of a world remade. She had been cast out, broken, and left with nothing. But in that nothingness, she had found everything. She had found her power, not in dominance, but in compassion. She had found her voice, not in shouting, but in listening. And she had found her home, not on a piece of land deeded by man, but in the heart of a herd, beside a noble stallion, under a vast and watchful sky. Trust, home, and love had not been given to her. They had been built, one splinter, one scar, and one quiet act of understanding at a time. And here, in the gentle gloaming, her world was finally beautifully whole.